Late-night settings have a way of softening the world, and this video begins there, in the quiet hours when most people are asleep and every room feels dimmer than it should. The kind of darkness where the air seems still, the house settles into its own breathing patterns, and the small, familiar sounds you never notice in the daytime become steady companions. Maybe it's the low hum of an appliance somewhere in the distance, or the faint shift of fabric as you turn in bed. Whatever the case, night creates its own atmosphere, one where your senses sharpen just enough to notice things you'd normally ignore. Most of the time, nothing is wrong. Most of the time, it's just the world resting. But those calm hours hold something else too, a quiet sensitivity, a subtle alertness as if your mind wakes before your body does. It's in those in-between moments when the light from the window is barely visible and you're not fully sure if you're dreaming or awake that small irregularities begin to stand out. A soft creak in the hallway you don't remember hearing before, the feeling of a presence in the room though everything appears still, or the simple awareness that something feels slightly shifted. These moments don't announce themselves. They settle gently, almost politely, as if asking whether you've noticed. And sometimes, when you finally open your eyes, you do notice. Not right away, more like a slow, creeping recognition that something is occupying the space where nothing should be. A silhouette where there shouldn't be one, a shape that doesn't belong to any piece of furniture, a sense that someone else is there, watching, waiting, standing too close. In tonight's stories, we step quietly into those moments, true accounts from people who woke in the dark to find they weren't alone, and let the unease grow at its own pace, the way it always does in the dark. I still remember that winter night more clearly than almost anything else from that year, even though nothing loud or dramatic happened. It was one of those nights where the cold felt heavier than usual, pressing against the windows, making the house creak in slow, tired stretches. I had gone to bed earlier than normal because the day had drained me, and the warmth of my blankets felt like the only comfortable thing left in the world. My room was dark except for the faint blue glow from the street light outside, the kind that softens the edges of furniture but never fully reveals anything. The air smelled faintly of dust and laundry detergent, and for a while I slept in a deep, dreamless quiet that felt almost protective. At some point deep into the night, I woke up, not suddenly, not startled, just awake. The way you wake up when your body senses a shift in the room before your mind catches up. I didn't move at first, I just lay there breathing in the cold air that had settled above my blankets. My eyes were half open, unfocused, and I figured I might have woken up because the heater had clicked off again. That happens sometimes, especially on colder nights. But as I listened for that soft, metallic click, it didn't come. All I could hear was the quiet hum of the house holding itself together. I don't know how long I stayed like that before I noticed something faintly different, like the air wasn't balanced right. Not colder or warmer, just occupied. You know how it feels when you're sure someone else is in the room even if they aren't touching anything or making a sound. It was that subtle but unmistakable. My breathing paused, not from fear at that point, but from a kind of quiet curiosity that hadn't yet turned into anything darker. The streetlight glow cut softly across the foot of my bed, and as my eyes adjusted a little more, I realized there was a shape there that I didn't recognize. At first, it didn't register as a person. It looked like a darker patch against the dimness of the room, unmoving and almost too still to be anything alive. I blinked slowly, thinking maybe I was half dreaming or looking at the shadow of my dresser at the wrong angle, but the outline didn't match any furniture I owned. It had a narrow top, wider shoulders, and the faint suggestion of arms hanging loosely at the sides. Not exaggerated, not monstrous, just human. A human in the most ordinary, terrifying way. I didn't panic, not immediately. In fact, my first instinct was to rationalize it away. Maybe my jacket had slipped from the chair. Maybe I had piled some clothes earlier without remembering. But even as I tried to convince myself, I could tell the shape wasn't static the way objects are. There was a density to it, a presence that felt deliberate. When I shifted ever so slightly under the blankets, the shadow didn't waver. It didn't flicker or distort. It stayed intact, as if it were anchored to the floor. My breathing grew shallow, and I remember the strange awareness that my heartbeat was too loud in my own ears. I thought about sitting up just to get a better look, but something about the situation made me move carefully, like I was afraid sudden motion would provoke whatever was standing there. I let my eyes adjust a little more to the darkness, waiting for the shape to reveal itself as something harmless. But instead, it started to feel more detailed, more defined, as though my mind was filling in information I didn't want. There was a faint tilt to the head, angled toward me in a way that suggested attention, not accident. The shoulders seemed to incline forward just enough to imply that the person, if it was a person, was leaning slightly observing. That realization brought with it a wave of cold that had nothing to do with the winter air. It was the kind of cold that starts in your stomach and spreads outward, tightening your chest before you even understand why. I found myself holding my breath, listening not for movement, but for breathing that wasn't mine. For a long moment there was nothing. The silence felt dense, almost crushing, like the whole room was waiting for something to happen. Then, in a soft, almost imperceptible shift, the figure moved. Not dramatically, not threateningly, just a single step forward as though testing the floorboards. The movement was so smooth and controlled that it felt intentional. That was the moment fear finally hit me in full. Not the kind that makes you scream or bolt upright, but the kind that freezes your thoughts and locks your body in place. My mind raced through every possible explanation, intruder, sleep paralysis, nightmare, but none of them fit. I knew I was awake. I knew I could move if I wanted to. And I knew with absolute clarity that the man at the foot of my bed was aware of me. I forced myself to blink, thinking maybe I'd snap out of whatever haze I was stuck in. But when my eyes opened again, the figure was closer, only slightly, but enough to erase any doubt that it was real. I could make out the slope of the shoulders, the shape of the arms, even the faint suggestion of a head leaning forward as if trying to see my face more clearly. But the darkness kept his features hidden, like the room refused to reveal who or what he was. A thousand thoughts flashed through my mind, none of them coherent. Should I sit up? Should I reach for the lamp? Should I pretend to sleep? But indecision held me trapped in place. I didn't want to startle him. That was the thought that kept echoing in my head. Don't startle him. I don't know why. There was no logic to it, but my instincts felt sharper than reasoning. I must have lain there for several long breaths, waiting for him to do something more, something that would tell me what he wanted. But instead, something stranger happened. The figure didn't move again, didn't shift, didn't lean, didn't retreat. It was as if he froze mid-step, pausing with an intent I couldn't read. And then, in a moment that felt like a curtain being pulled across my vision, everything went dark. Not like fainting, more like blinking longer than I intended. So when I opened my eyes again, the room was empty. The foot of the bed was just empty space lit by the weak blue glow from outside. My dresser sat exactly where it always had. The air felt normal again, balanced, no longer occupied by something unseen. I sat up slowly, waiting for the shape to reappear, but it didn't, not that night and not any night after. Still, every winter, when the nights are the coldest and the heater clicks off for no reason, I find myself waking up in the same quiet way, half aware, eyes barely open. And every time I do, I expect to see him again, just standing there, watching, waiting for me to notice him the way I did that night. I don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but the memory hasn't softened with time. If anything, it feels sharper now, like a reminder that sometimes you truly are being watched while you sleep, and sometimes you only wake up because the person watching you wants you to. I've told this story only a handful of times in my life, mostly because even now, years later, I still can't explain it without feeling that same heavy silence settle over me. It happened when I was about 8 or 9, back when my bedroom was still filled with glow-in-the-dark stickers, stuffed animals lined across the shelves, and a nightlight shaped like a tiny moon plugged into the wall. It was winter, and the kind of cold that makes the floorboards crack quietly at night whenever the temperature shifted. My room always felt smaller during those months, like the darkness pressed closer around me once the lights were out. I used to fall asleep listening to the soft buzz of that nightlight and the muffled sound of my parents' TV in the next room. Most nights, those sounds made me feel safe, wrapped in a familiar bubble of warmth and routine. That night started no differently. I remember the blanket pulled up to my chin, the faint warmth of my breath trapped inside it, and the dim halo of light from the nightlight glowing in the corner of the room. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I remember is waking up in that strange, weightless way where your mind returns before your eyes do. There was no nightmare, no sudden jolt, just awareness returning in slow, quiet waves. At first, I didn't move. I didn't need to. The room felt still, the kind of stillness that usually meant I'd woken up for no reason at all. But then I heard it, a soft inhale, then an equally soft exhale. Slow, steady, and close, much closer than it should have been. At first, I assumed it was my own breathing echoing under the blankets, so I held my breath for a moment, expecting the sound to stop. Instead, the breathing continued, unhurried, calm, completely independent of my own rhythms. It was right beside me, close enough that I could almost sense the air shifting with each exhale. I kept my eyes closed, wondering if maybe I was still dreaming, but the more I listened, the more certain I became that this was real. I tried to convince myself it was the dog, even though she never slept in my room. Or maybe the heater had kicked on in some weird way, creating a rhythmic sound that happened to resemble breathing. But the heater wasn't running. I could tell because the room felt cold enough that my fingers tingled just above the blanket. The nightlight buzzed faintly, and with each soft rise and fall of the unknown breath, I found myself holding my own again, longer this time, waiting for the room to fall silent. It didn't. Well, the breathing stayed. Eventually, I opened my eyes just a sliver, not enough to give away that I was awake, but enough to let my vision adjust to the dim blue glow of the nightlight. My room looked the same as always, the dresser in the corner, the shelf cluttered with toys, the faint outline of the curtains swaying slightly in a draft. But there was something else, something just out of my direct line of sight. A shape near the edge of the bed that hadn't been there when I fell asleep. I didn't dare turn my head toward it. Instead, I stayed perfectly still, waiting for it to move and reveal itself as a pile of clothes or a shadow cast strangely by the nightlight. But the breathing told me otherwise. It was too close, too human, too warm to be anything lifeless. It was the kind of breathing that comes from someone leaning over you, the quiet, measured sound of a person trying not to wake you. My heart started beating faster, though I kept my body motionless, terrified that any sudden shift would draw attention. The breathing grew slightly louder, not enough to be aggressive, but enough that I could tell whoever or whatever was making it had changed their position. It felt like they were leaning even closer, studying me in the dark. I could feel faint warmth near my cheek, the kind of warmth you only feel when another person is inches away. I remember wondering why my parents didn't hear anything, why the house felt suddenly too quiet, as if the world had narrowed down to just me and whatever was hovering beside me. A strange pressure settled in my chest, a sensation like being watched intensely without being touched. I didn't understand fear the way adults do back then, but I understood danger. Every instinct I had told me not to move, not to breathe, not to acknowledge what was beside me. After what felt like several minutes, though I have no way to know the real length of time, the breathing changed. It became more deliberate, less quiet, as if the person was adjusting their position. The faint warmth against my cheek shifted slightly, and that was the moment I knew I had to gather the courage to move, even if just an inch. I lifted my right shoulder slowly, pretending to roll in my sleep, hopping to break the moment without provoking whatever was there. The breathing stopped instantly. The silence that followed was so absolute it felt like the whole room was holding its breath with me. I lay still again, waiting. Then, in the dim corner of my vision, I saw the shape pull back, not with the natural motion of a person stepping away, but with a slow, drifting movement that felt impossibly smooth. The figure receded toward the foot of the bed, slipping into a darker patch of the room where the nightlight couldn't reach. I didn't look at it directly, not then. I was too afraid that making eye contact would confirm something I couldn't handle. Instead, I stared straight ahead at the wall, breathing as quietly as I could, waiting for the shape to return or speak or do anything at all, but nothing happened. After several long moments, the room returned to a familiar stillness. The irregular warmth faded. The air felt balanced again. It took every ounce of courage I had to reach out and flick on the lamp beside my bed. When the warm light filled the room, the corner where the figure had settled was empty. My toys sat undisturbed on the shelf. The nightlight buzzed faintly, unchanged. Nothing was out of place. But something had been there. Something that breathed beside me, hovered inches from my face, and watched me sleep. I never told my parents. I don't think I knew how to explain it in a way that didn't sound like a nightmare. But I avoided sleeping in that room for weeks afterward, convincing myself to stay on the couch or crawl into my parents' bed in the middle of the night. And even as I grew older and the house changed and my childhood bedroom became something else entirely, I never forgot that night. To this day, sometimes I wake up in the same slow, drifting way, with the memory of breath on my cheek lingering like a cold fingerprint. I lie still and wait, listening to the silence, making sure it's only my own breathing that fills the room. But every once in a while, just barely, I swear I feel that same warm exhale against my skin. Just a reminder, maybe. A hint that whatever watched me all those years ago might not have left after all. Hospitals at night have a strange way of changing shape, or at least that's how it felt to me when I spent those few days recovering after my surgery. During the daytime, the place felt almost comforting. Bright lights, distant footsteps, nurses chatting softly in the hallway. But once the sun went down, everything settled into a different kind of quiet, heavier, and more thoughtful. The fluorescent lights dimmed into a softer glow, the halls emptied, and the only sounds that remained were the occasional beeps of machines and the low hum of the ventilation system. My room was on the far end of the ward, near a window that faced a parking lot, and at night I could see the faint orange halos of the streetlights pressing through the blinds. I remember thinking that it wasn't a bad place to rest, even if the sheets were rough and the air smelled faintly of disinfectant. That particular night, I fell asleep in a strange, half-floating way, the kind of sleep that comes after pain medication when your thoughts drift quietly from one place to another. I could hear the soft whirring of the IV pump beside me, a steady reminder that I wasn't at home. I kept drifting in and out, sometimes waking just enough to notice the cold air brushing against my arms before sinking back down. The room was dim except for the small monitor light blinking near my bed, casting a faint glow across the floor. Nothing felt unusual at first. If anything, it felt safer than it had earlier, like the worst part of the day was behind me. But then, in one of those soft awakenings where the world returns slowly, I became aware of a subtle sound, nothing dramatic, just the faint creak of the visitor's chair beside my bed. At first, I dismissed it, thinking it was the building settling or the nurse adjusting something before she left. But the sound lingered, a quiet shift of weight, the kind a person makes when they're trying to sit more comfortably. It was so gentle that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it. Yet something inside me stirred, the way it does when you know you aren't alone even before you open your eyes. I kept my eyes closed for a moment longer, listening. There was no shuffling, no breathing, no rustle of clothing, just the heavy silence of a late-night hospital room. But the air felt different, subtly occupied, like another presence was absorbing part of the space. That awareness drifted closer to consciousness until I finally blinked my eyes open, letting them adjust to the dimness. Someone was sitting in the chair beside my bed. Their back was turned to me, shoulders slightly hunched, as if leaning forward in thought. For a moment, I wasn't scared at all. I assumed it was a nurse or maybe even my mom checking on me, though she had gone home hours earlier. The figure sat unusually still, their posture stiff, hands resting on their knees. The hospital gown they wore looked thin and pale, blending with the dim light. Something in the way they sat struck me as strange. The chair was positioned too close, closer than anyone had sat before. My voice caught in my throat when I tried to speak. It wasn't fear yet, just the dryness from sleep and medication. I swallowed and tried again, a quiet, hesitant sound that barely made it past my lips. The figure didn't move, didn't turn, didn't react in any way to acknowledge I was awake. The stillness stretched on longer than felt natural, like whoever was sitting there was deliberately holding still. I tried shifting my hand toward the call button on the side rail, moving slowly so I wouldn't startle them. My fingers brushed the plastic, but before I could press it, the figure's head turned just slightly, enough for me to see the edge of their cheek and the dark hollowness where their eye should have caught the light. But it didn't catch any light. The face felt wrong in a way I couldn't identify, not broken, not twisted, just empty. As though the person was looking through me instead of at me. A chill ran through me so sharply I stopped moving altogether. The figure's breathing was silent, too silent. No rise of the shoulders, no shift of cloth. They weren't doing anything except watching in a way that didn't feel curious or compassionate but patient, waiting for something I didn't understand. I forced myself to blink just to break the moment, and when my eyes opened again, the chair was empty. No creak, no shift, no sound of someone standing or walking away, just absence. The chair sat exactly where it always had, angled slightly toward the window. My heartbeat kicked into a faster rhythm as I scanned the room, half expecting to see the figure standing somewhere else. But the room was still and silent as if nothing had happened. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the empty chair. Every so often, I told myself I must have been dreaming, that the medication had played tricks on my senses, that the faint light had twisted the shadows into something human. But the weight in the chair had been real. The posture had been real. The stillness, too human, too deliberate, had been real. By the time morning came, I almost convinced myself to mention it to the nurse during her rounds. But when she came in cheerful and tired, asking how I'd slept, I hesitated. Something about the brightness of the morning made the memory feel fragile, like speaking it out loud would make it real in a way I wasn't ready for. So I just nodded and said I slept fine. Later that day, while they took my vitals, I casually asked whether anyone checked on me during the night. The nurse glanced at the chart and shook her head. "No," she said. "Your floor was quiet, nobody needed anything. You were asleep every time we peeked in." And I didn't ask anything else. Even now, long after the hospital smell faded from my clothes and the stitches healed into thin scars, I sometimes think about that figure sitting in the chair. The way it leaned forward, as if listening for the moment I woke up. The way it turned its head with a slow, unnatural calm. I've wondered who it was supposed to be, or whether it had ever been alive at all. And every now and then, when I wake during the night for no reason, I feel a faint heaviness in the air beside me. The same quiet presence, the same subtle shift of space. And I can't help but wonder if the visitor ever really left that room, or if it simply followed me home. So I rented that airbnb because it was cheap, nothing more. It sat on the edge of a small town I'd never visited before, tucked between a row of old houses and a narrow side street that barely fit one car at a time. I had arrived late in the evening after a long drive, tired enough that I didn't care about the peeling paint on the porch or the way the lock stuck for a second before turning. Inside, the place smelled faintly of damp wood and old fabric, the kind of scent that never quite leaves homes that have been lived in too long by too many people. The lights were dim, even at full brightness, and the blinds in the bedroom didn't close all the way, leaving a thin line of street glow cutting across the wall. I told myself it was fine for one night. I wasn't there for comfort, just a few hours of sleep before an early meeting in the morning. I unpacked only the things I needed, tossed my bag near the dresser, and crawled into bed with the exhaustion still clinging to my bones. The mattress was softer than I expected, sinking slightly under my weight, and for a while the quiet felt almost soothing. The house creaked every now and then, old wood expanding and settling, but that didn't bother me. Most old places did that. I let my eyes adjust to the low light, tracking the faint shadows along the corners before drifting off. Nothing felt unusual, nothing felt wrong. In fact, I remember thinking I might even sleep better than I did at home. Sometime later, hours maybe, I woke up without knowing why. My eyes opened on their own slowly, the way they do when your body senses something but your mind hasn't caught up yet. I didn't move right away. The room was dim, washed in a pale, bluish line of light leaking through the blinds. The air felt colder than before, heavy in a way that made me hesitate to shift the blanket. I listened for anything familiar: distant cars, a neighbor's TV, the quiet hum of the small refrigerator in the kitchenette. And everything was still, too still, like the house was holding its breath. Then I heard it, a soft creak on the floorboards. Not the random, settling kind. This one had weight behind it, a slow, deliberate shift, the kind a person makes when they're trying not to be heard. I felt the tiniest pull in my chest, a tightening that made my breath shallow. I stayed perfectly still, letting my eyes adjust a little more to the dim room. At first, I thought the sound came from the hallway, but then I realized it was closer, much closer, inside the bedroom. I didn't want to look, I didn't want to confirm what the sound already suggested. But eventually my eyes drifted toward the foot of the bed, scanning that line of soft blue light that sliced across the floor. That's when I saw a shape, tall, still, almost blending into the shadows. My heart thudded, slow at first, then faster as the shape took form, not a piece of furniture, not a trick of the light. Someone was standing in the room, leaning slightly forward as if studying me. For a moment, I thought I must be dreaming. My mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was a coat on a stand, maybe I'd left my bag somewhere odd, maybe the shadows were playing tricks on me. But the longer I stared, the clearer the outline became. Shoulders, head, arms resting at their sides. A person, a stranger. I felt a cold ripple run through me, enough that I almost gasped. The figure didn't move, didn't shift or sway or adjust their stance. They were watching me. I could feel that even though I couldn't see their eyes. I considered sitting up. I considered speaking, but something deeper, something instinctive, told me that sudden movement would change everything in a way I wasn't prepared for. My breathing grew shallow, almost silent. I kept my gaze as still as possible, hoping my eyes weren't obvious in the darkness. The figure stayed motionless for so long that part of me wondered if they were holding their breath too. The silence became thick, suffocating, and the longer it stretched, the more unbearable the tension grew. Then slowly, so slowly I almost doubted it, the figure lifted their head. Not much, just enough to acknowledge the shift, enough to make me certain they knew I was awake. A soft sound followed, not quite a step, not quite a sigh, more like fabric brushing lightly against skin. I felt every muscle in my body tighten. The figure leaned slightly forward, just a fraction, and in that faint movement something became terrifyingly clear. They weren't trying to hide. They weren't startled that I saw them. They were waiting. I swallowed hard, the sound loud in my own ears, and forced myself to reach under the pillow where I'd left my phone. My fingers trembled as they brushed the corner of the device. I didn't look away from the shadow. The movement had to be slow, controlled. But as soon as I started to slide my hand beneath the pillow, the figure shifted again, this time stepping back into the darkness near the open doorway. It wasn't a normal step. There was no sound, no weight on the floorboards. The movement was too smooth, too controlled, like gliding rather than walking. When the figure reached the threshold, they paused again. The darkness swallowed most of their details, but the outline remained unmistakably human, unmistakably present. I blinked once, just a reflex, and when my eyes opened, the figure was gone. The hallway beyond the door was empty. The room was silent again, eerily so. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had changed. I remained frozen for several minutes, waiting for another sound, another shadow, anything at all, but the room stayed still, too still. Eventually, I forced myself to turn on the lamp beside the bed. The warm light filled the room, washing away the shadows. The corner was empty, the doorway empty. My bag still sat where I dropped it earlier. Nothing looked disturbed. But I knew what I had seen. As I spent the rest of the night sitting upright, lamp on, blanket pulled around me. I waited for sunrise, counting the minutes like a child terrified of the dark. The moment the sky began to lighten, I packed my things and walked out without looking back. I didn't shower. I didn't check the kitchen. I didn't explore the hallway. I just left. Later, after I'd reached the safety of a crowded cafe, I pulled up the Airbnb listing again. I scrolled through the reviews, not sure what I was looking for, until one comment caught my eye, written months before my stay. Just 6 words buried among dozens of normal reviews. I woke up to someone in the room. My stomach dropped. I kept scrolling and found another review further down. Felt watched all night, never again. And another, saw something standing by the bed. Different people, different dates, different details, but all the same terror I had felt. I never reported what happened. I didn't reach out to the host. I didn't leave a review. Some part of me felt that describing it out loud would make it too real, too solid. Instead, I simply moved on, though the memory never softened. Even now, when I stay somewhere unfamiliar, hotel, guest room, anywhere, I wake up at least once during the night. Every time, without fail, my eyes drift to the foot of the bed, just in case a figure stands there again, silent and watching, waiting for me to notice them in the dark. I've never been someone who scares easily, especially at night. I grew up sleeping with my door open, letting the dim hallway light spill across my room, and even as an adult, I've always found comfort in the soft, steady hum of my fan. It's the kind of sound that fills the silence just enough to make a space feel lived in. My bedroom at the time was small but warm, with a low shelf near the window where I kept a few books, and a lamp that cast a soft amber tone across the walls when I couldn't sleep. Most nights ended the same way. I would stretch out, pull the blanket to my chest, listen to the fan's quiet whir, and drift off without much thought. That particular night began exactly like that: ordinary, familiar, safe. The room felt cooler than usual when I fell asleep, but I didn't think much of it. Winter had settled in early that year, and the windows were old enough that drafts slipped through no matter how tightly I closed them. I remember curling deeper into the blankets, watching the soft shadow of the spinning fan blades trace lazy shapes across the wall. Nothing unusual, nothing out of place. I must have fallen asleep quickly, because the next thing I remember was waking in a quiet so complete it took me a moment to understand what was wrong. Well, the fan had stopped. It wasn't a loud noise that woke me, not a bang or a creak, just the sudden absence of sound. When you're used to sleeping with constant white noise, silence feels startling in its own way, like someone has placed a hand on your shoulder even if no one is there. I opened my eyes slowly, blinked against the faint moonlight spilling in through the curtains, and waited for the fan to buzz back to life. It didn't. The room felt still in a way that didn't match the hour, as though something had paused the world for just a moment. Then I felt it, something warm and steady, almost like breath brushing near my cheek. At first, I thought it was my own breathing bouncing off the blanket, but when I shifted slightly, the warmth stayed exactly where it was. I lay there, barely moving, letting my eyes adjust to the dimness. The room was washed in pale gray light, enough to make out familiar shapes: the dresser, the window frame, the edge of the shelf. Everything looked normal. But there was something else, something so close to me that I could sense its presence even before I saw it. A shadow sat beside my pillow. At first, it looked like nothing more than a patch of darkness, just a trick of the light, maybe a fold in the blanket or the outline of my hair falling oddly. But the longer I stared, the clearer the shape became. It wasn't flat the way shadows are. It had volume, a curve, a slight incline, as though something was crouched there, leaning toward my face, close enough that I could feel its quiet warmth in the air. For a moment, I held perfectly still, hoping my brain was just misreading the dim light. I let my eyes focus slowly, taking in every small detail: the faint rise of the shadow, the way it blocked the faint glow from the window, the impression of something bending over me. It didn't move, it didn't shift. It just hovered, inches away from where my head rested. My heart began to thud in a slow, heavy rhythm, not racing, just deep, as if my body was bracing itself for something I couldn't yet understand. I tried to listen for breathing that wasn't mine, but the room was silent, too silent. The shadow seemed to absorb the quiet, drawing it in until the only sound I could hear was the soft pulse in my ears. As a thought flickered through my mind: if I turn on the lamp, it will disappear. Another followed: what if it does? The shadow remained close, unmoving, patient. I could almost sense the weight of it pressing into the mattress, as though someone was kneeling there. My fingers twitched beneath the blanket, and without thinking, I shifted my arm a fraction of an inch. The shadow responded instantly. It rose. Not quickly, not abruptly, just a slow, deliberate lift, as though it were straightening itself to get a better look at me. I felt the air shift against my cheek, the warmth fading as something taller formed beside me. I dared to move my eyes, tracking the dark shape as it pulled up and back, taking on a height that made no sense crouched on such a small bed. It didn't step away, it didn't vanish. It simply stood there, an outline in the dimness, its head tilted slightly as if studying me more closely. But for a moment that stretched far too long, the room held its breath with me. The silence became weighty, thick, like the air just before a storm. I waited for movement, a lunge, a sound, anything, but what happened next was far worse. Well, the shadow began to recede. Not by walking, not by turning, but by dissolving back into the darker corner of the room. Slowly, its shape thinned, flattening into the darkness until it no longer had depth at all. It sank into the wall or the air or the space between them, I couldn't tell. And when it was gone, the silence didn't lift. It settled even heavier, like whatever had been watching me was still somewhere nearby, just hidden now. I didn't move for several minutes. My breath stayed shallow, my body still curled in the same position, eyes locked on the corner where the shadow had disappeared. Eventually, with shaking hands, I reached over and turned on the lamp. Its warm light flooded the room, pushing back the dimness, turning every corner and surface into something familiar again. But nothing felt reassuring. The air still felt disturbed, like a curtain had been drawn back only moments before. The fan remained motionless, its plug still secure in the wall. And when I stepped out of bed to examine the room, the corner where the shadow had retreated felt colder than the rest, just slightly, but enough to make my skin prickle. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. And for weeks afterward, I found myself waking at the slightest shift in silence, convinced I would see that shadow beside my pillow again, crouched close enough to touch me. I never did. But sometimes, when the fan shuts off unexpectedly or when the room falls too quiet too quickly, I feel that same warmth brush near my face, faint and deliberate. As if something is leaning close again. Checking if I'm awake, waiting for me to open my eyes. I rented the cabin because I wanted a quiet place to reset for a weekend, somewhere far enough from the city that I could hear myself think again. It was tucked between tall pines on a narrow gravel road that barely saw any traffic, the kind of place people described as peaceful in a way that felt earned. When I first arrived, the air smelled clean and sharp, like cold earth and the faint sweetness of sap. The cabin itself was small, simple, one bedroom, a small living area, a kitchenette, but it felt warm and inviting, with soft wooden walls that caught the late afternoon light. I remember thinking it was exactly the kind of quiet I needed, the kind where the loudest sound was the wind brushing through the trees. My first evening there was uneventful. I unpacked a few things, warmed up some leftover food I'd brought with me, and spent an hour sitting on the porch watching the forest turn darker shade by shade as the sun disappeared behind the treetops. The temperature dropped quickly once night came. By the time I went inside, the cabin felt cooler, the kind of cold that settles into the wooden floorboards. I turned on the small electric heater, listened to it hum itself awake, and settled into bed with a book. The quiet outside was almost absolute. No cars, no voices, just the occasional rustle of branches shifting in the wind. I must have fallen asleep with the lamp still on because I woke sometime past midnight to its dim amber glow still warming the room. The heater had shut off again, something it apparently did automatically after a few hours, and the air felt icy against my skin. My breath came out in soft, faint puffs, and I tucked myself deeper under the blanket, planning to get up and restart the heater once I gathered the motivation. But then I heard it, a soft tapping, faint but steady, like a fingertip brushing gently against glass. At first, I thought it was a branch hitting the window. The wind outside hadn't been strong when I fell asleep, but nighttime in the woods can be unpredictable. I lay still for a moment, listening. The tapping came again and again, spaced evenly with a rhythm too deliberate to be the wind. I opened my eyes fully, letting them adjust to the dim lamplight, and turned my head toward the window beside the bed. All I saw at first was the reflection of the lamp in the glass, a soft oval glow against the darkness. Outside, everything was pitch black beyond the small circle of light around the cabin. The tapping stopped for a moment and I held my breath, waiting for it to return. When it did, it sounded closer, sharper this time, like someone tracing their nail down the surface. A cold ripple ran through me, settling somewhere deep in my chest. I sat up slowly, trying not to make the bed creak, and stared at the window, hoping to catch the branch or whatever it was causing the sound. But as the tapping continued, something about it didn't feel right. It came from the middle of the window, not the edge, and it didn't sway or vary the way a branch would in the wind. It was steady, intentional. Then in the faint glow from the lamp I saw it, a pale shape pressed against the glass. At first my mind didn't register it as a face. It looked like a smudge of light, an irregular blur against the dark outside. But as my eyes adjusted, the shape sharpened. I saw the curve of a cheek, the faint outline of a brow, and the hollow darkness of eyes staring directly into the room. The face was expressionless still, as though frozen in the act of watching. I didn't move, I didn't even breathe. Every instinct in me screamed to turn away, to hide under the blanket, to run, but I couldn't. My body locked itself in place as I tried to understand what I was seeing. The face was inches from the glass, pressed so close I could see the faint mist of breath fogging a small patch near its mouth. The realization hit me like a physical weight. Whoever it was had been standing there for longer than I'd been awake. Well, then the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. The face remained motionless, eyes fixed on me with an intensity that felt impossible to meet. I wondered if the person could see the lamplight reflecting in my eyes or the slight rise and fall of my chest. The hair on my arms stood on end, prickling against the cold as a wave of nausea hit me. I didn't know if the person outside meant harm or if their stillness was something far worse. Without looking away from the window, I reached slowly for the lamp, thinking if I turned it off, the darkness would hide me again. But the moment my hand brushed the switch, the face shifted. Not a full movement, just the slightest tilt of the head as if it were trying to see me more clearly. The dark eyes widened a fraction, catching more of the lamplight, and something like a faint smile tugged at the corner of its mouth. My hand froze above the lamp. I stared back, unable to look away, caught between fear and disbelief. Another soft breath fogged the glass. That's when I realized something else. The window was nearly 6 feet off the ground from the outside. Whoever was looking in had to be standing on something or was tall enough to stare in effortlessly. The thought chilled me deeper than the cold air ever could. I forced myself to move, inching my hand from the lamp to the edge of the blanket. I slid my legs out of the bed slowly, trying not to break the eye contact I feared would trigger something. The face didn't move. It just watched, waiting. When my feet touched the floor, a soft creak echoed through the cabin, barely audible but enough to break the stillness. The face reacted instantly. It pulled back from the glass with a speed that didn't seem human, disappearing into the darkness outside without a step, without a sound, as though it had melted into the shadows. I stared at the empty window for several long minutes, waiting to see the pale outline return. It didn't. When I finally gathered enough courage to crawl toward the foot of the bed and restart the heater, my hands shook uncontrollably. I turned on every light in the cabin and sat awake until dawn. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. My breath clouded in the morning air as I walked around to the window. Beneath it, the ground was covered in frost, and in the frost were footprints. Human, bare, each print sharp and clear, leading from the tree line straight to the cabin and stopping directly beneath my window. But there were no prints leading away. As I left within the hour, driving down that gravel road like something might step out of the trees at any moment. Sometimes, late at night, when I catch my reflection in my own window at home, I think about that face pressed against the cabin glass. The pale skin, the hollow eyes, the breath fogging the cold pain. And I can't help wondering if it ever really left the window, or if it's just waiting for me to turn off the lights again. When I moved into that apartment, I wasn't trying to reinvent my life or start over or anything dramatic like that. I just needed somewhere quiet, somewhere close to my job, somewhere that felt like my own. It was an older building, the kind with echoing hallways and thin walls that carried the distant murmurs of neighbors you'd never actually meet. But it had charm. Warm light in the lobby, a small courtyard out back, and a hallway that always smelled faintly of old books and lemon cleaner. My unit was near the middle of the floor, not too close to the elevators, not too far from the laundry room. I remember liking the simplicity of it. It felt lived in, comfortable in the way places can only get with age. The first few weeks were uneventful. I got used to the low creaks the floor made when I walked from the bedroom to the kitchen, and the soft hum of the old fridge that took a second to wake up in the mornings. Nights were generally quiet. I'd hear the occasional closing door or footsteps in the hallway, but nothing unusual. Nothing that made me feel uncomfortable. If anything, the familiar sounds became a kind of reassurance that I wasn't alone in the building. It was a month or so in right as the weather began cooling and the early nights settled in that I experienced the first shift. I remember waking up one night for no particular reason, the kind of groggy, half-conscious wakefulness where you're aware of the room but not fully in it. The clock on my nightstand glowed 2:17 a.m. in soft red digits. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional whisper of wind outside. As I lay still for a moment, trying to figure out what had woken me, but nothing stood out. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle in the hallway just beyond my bedroom door. Not footsteps exactly, but a dragging, slow movement like slippers sliding across the floor. I told myself it was a neighbor coming home late, maybe someone carrying bags or walking half asleep. The walls were thin after all, but something about the sound felt closer than it should have been, as though it wasn't out in the shared hallway, but just beyond my bedroom door inside my apartment. I sat up slightly, listening. The dragging noise stopped. Silence settled over the apartment again, so heavy it made my ears ring. I almost got out of bed to check the door, but the silence made me hesitate. Eventually, I convinced myself I was imagining it and lay back down. It took a long time to fall asleep. For the next several nights, nothing happened. But then, slowly, the soft shuffling returned. Always late, always slow, and always just close enough to my door that I couldn't quite tell if it was inside or outside my apartment. Sometimes it sounded like fabric brushing against the wall. Other times it was the barely audible click of something tapping the floor, like a cane or a piece of wood making intermittent contact. One night, unable to shake the tension, I got out of bed and approached the door. The hallway light outside cast a thin band of yellow beneath the door frame, glowing faintly against the dark wood of the flooring. I stood there, listening, waiting for the sound again. When it came, it was so soft I almost doubted it, a slow, dragging shuffle that paused whenever I held my breath. And after several minutes of silence, I worked up the courage to open the door. But the hallway was empty. Just the familiar soft yellow lights stretching down a long corridor that felt somehow longer at night. I stepped out, peered both ways, and saw nothing but the closed doors of other apartments. No movement, no lingering noise. The air smelled faintly of cleaner again, that same lemon scent strangely sharper in the stillness. I went back inside, but sleep didn't come easily after that. A week later, things changed. I woke up again in the middle of the night, but this time something felt immediately off. There was a pressure in the air, a heaviness that settled over my chest before I even turned my head toward the door. My room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the hallway light spilling through the crack at the bottom of the door. But the glow was blocked slightly, as if something was standing outside, interrupting the strip of light. I couldn't move at first. Fear held me in place, cold and slow. I stared at that dim glow, watching the small, subtle break in its shape. My eyes strained to adjust, and the longer I stared, the clearer it became that there was indeed something just beyond the door, something tall, something still. Finally, gathering what little courage I had, I eased myself upright, reached for my phone, and crept toward the door. My hand trembled as I touched the handle. Everything was silent on the other side, no breathing, no shuffling, nothing. I hesitated, then slowly pulled the door open. What I saw will never leave me. An old woman stood in the hallway, right in front of my doors. Her posture was stiff, unnaturally straight, as though she were being held up by invisible strings. Her hands hung loosely at her sides, fingers slightly curled. She wore a long housecoat that looked dated, something from decades ago, faded and frayed around the edges. Her hair was thin and gray, falling in uneven strands around her face. But her eyes were the worst part. They reflected the hallway lights in a way that made them look glassy, too bright, too empty. She didn't blink, she didn't move, she didn't even seem to breathe. She just stared at me, her head tilted slightly to one side as if she were trying to understand what she was looking at. I stepped back instinctively, gripping the doorframe for support. My voice caught in my throat, the air suddenly feeling too cold to breathe. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I managed to say, though the words felt wrong leaving my mouth. She didn't answer. She didn't react at all. She simply watched me, unblinking, her expression suspended between blankness and something deeper, something that felt like hunger for recognition. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, frozen, waiting for her to say something, anything, but she didn't. And then, without warning, her head straightened. Her shoulders rose just slightly, and she stepped back, not turning, not shifting, but gliding as if her feet didn't fully lift from the floor. As in the time it took for me to blink, she was suddenly 3 feet farther down the hallway. Another blink, 5 feet. Then she was gone, swallowed by the shadows beyond the nearest flickering light. I closed my door so fast the sound echoed in the silence. I barely slept that night, lying awake in the cold, listening for any return of shuffling footsteps or the soft brush of fabric along the walls. But nothing came. The building stayed still, the hallway lights humming quietly on the other side of the door. The next morning, desperate for some sort of explanation, I asked the building manager if any elderly residents lived on my floor. Oh, he shook his head, then paused. He told me the only elderly tenant who'd lived there, a woman in her 80s, had passed away nearly a year before I moved in. She lived in the unit 3 doors down from mine, found in her hallway, lying on the floor just outside her apartment. He told me she used to wander the hall late at night when she couldn't sleep, shuffling softly so she wouldn't wake the neighbors. I didn't respond, I didn't need to. The cold in my chest deepened. I moved out 2 weeks later, leaving most of my furniture behind. But sometimes, When I wake up in the middle of the night for no clear reason, I swear I see that same dim strip of light beneath my bedroom door shifting ever so slightly, like something is standing on the other side, waiting for me to open it just one more time. Night has a way of revealing things we'd rather never notice, and after hearing these stories, it's hard not to think about all the moments we woke up without knowing why. How many times we rolled over, convinced it was nothing, unaware of what might have been watching us from the quiet dark. These accounts linger because they feel so close, so ordinary, like they could belong to anyone who's ever opened their eyes in the middle of the night and felt that subtle shift in the room. The fear doesn't always come with footsteps or voices. Sometimes it arrives in silence, in stillness, in the simple awareness that we are not as alone as we think. As you settle back into your own space now, there's a strange comfort in knowing that every person who listened tonight understands that same feeling, that subtle dread that lives in the corners of our memories. We share these moments not to frighten each other, but to remind ourselves that the darkness holds stories we rarely talk about. Stories that whisper something familiar, something we've all felt but never named. If anything tonight has stayed with you, it's because these experiences echo truths we don't often admit, that the quietest moments are the ones that stay with us the longest. If you'd like to wander deeper into these late-night confessions, you're welcome to return here whenever sleep feels far away. I share these stories so no one has to sit alone with that uneasy feeling, and if you choose to subscribe or share this space with others, it simply means the circle grows a little wider. But for now, let the room around you settle, let the air grow still again, and let your breathing find its rhythm. I'll leave you here in the soft quiet where night begins to fold into itself. Whatever shadows linger at the edges of your memory, let them fade gently. And if you wake in the dark tonight, just breathe, stay calm, and remember that some stories are meant to be heard and others only remembered in silence. Good night.